Captain Sarah Mitchell never spoke much about her flying. She preferred to let her skills do the talking. At 32 years old, she had logged over 4,000 hours in the cockpit of various aircraft. Her fellow pilots called her Ghost because of how quietly she moved through the sky and how she seemed to appear out of nowhere when needed most. Sarah grew up in rural Montana on a cattle ranch. Her father, John Mitchell, was a former Air Force mechanic who spent his weekends restoring old crop dusters. Every Saturday morning, Sarah would sit in the hangar and watch him work on engines. By age 10, she could identify aircraft types just by the sound of their engines. By 15, she was flying solo in her father's restored Cessna 172. The military was never Sarah's first choice. She wanted to be a commercial pilot. But the aviation industry was tough for women in the early 2000s. Many airlines still questioned whether female pilots could handle emergency situations. Sarah proved them wrong every chance she got. During flight school, she set records for precision flying and emergency response times. Her instructor said she had a natural feel for aircraft that couldn't be taught. When the Army offered her a position flying medical evacuation helicopters, Sarah accepted. The job would give her the flight hours she needed and let her help people at the same time. She specialized in flying UH-60 Blackhawks in dangerous conditions. Night flights, bad weather, enemy territory. Sarah handled it all with calm precision. Her reputation grew quickly among the Special Operations community. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Marine Force recon units all requested Sarah's team for their most critical missions. She had a perfect record. Every wounded soldier she flew made it home alive. Her radio call sign was Angel 7, but most troops just called her the Ghost. Sarah's commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, noticed her unique abilities early. She could fly in conditions that grounded other pilots. Dense fog, sandstorms, heavy rain, nothing seemed to faze her. More importantly, she could land her helicopter in spaces that other pilots considered impossible. Basketball courts, rooftops, narrow roads. Sarah found a way to get her bird down wherever soldiers needed help. The night everything changed started like any other mission. Sarah was stationed at a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. The temperature was dropping fast as winter approached the mountains. Intelligence reports suggested Taliban activity was increasing in the region. American forces were conducting more nighttime operations to disrupt enemy movements. At 21:30 hours, the base radio crackled to life. A Navy SEAL team was requesting immediate medical evacuation. Their mission had gone wrong somewhere in the mountains 20 miles northeast of the base. Details were scarce, but the team leader's voice carried an urgency that made everyone in the operations center pay attention. Sarah was in her quarters reading when the alarm sounded. She grabbed her flight gear and ran toward the flight line. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, was already starting the pre-flight checks on their UH-60. Rodriguez had been flying with Sarah for 2 years. He trusted her completely and knew that when she got that focused look in her eyes, something important was happening. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked as she strapped on her helmet. "SEAL Team Alpha 7 went dark about 30 minutes ago," Rodriguez replied. "Last radio contact put them in a valley near the Pakistani border. Rough terrain, no landing zones marked on the maps." Sarah studied the navigation charts while Rodriguez finished the equipment checks. The target area was mountainous with steep cliffs and narrow valleys. Weather reports showed clouds moving in from the west. In a few hours, the whole region would be socked in with zero visibility. The radio operator handed Sarah a headset connected to the base communications. "Angel 7, this is operations. We're getting intermittent radio contact with Alpha 7. They're in serious trouble but can't give us exact coordinates. You'll need to find them." "Copy that, operations. What's their last known position?" "Grid reference 842395. They were moving east toward the extraction point when contact was lost." Sarah looked at the map. The grid reference was in a valley system with multiple branches. Each valley looked the same from the air, rocky, narrow, and filled with shadows even during daylight. At night, finding anything would be nearly impossible without thermal imaging equipment, which their Black Hawk didn't have. Operations. Do we have any other aircraft in the area? Negative, Angel 7. Closest air support is 2 hours out. You're the only bird available. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 12 Navy SEALs were somewhere in those mountains, and she was their only hope for getting home alive. She had flown difficult rescue missions before, but never in terrain this challenging with so little information. Rodriguez climbed into the crew chief position and gave Sarah a thumbs up. Their medic, Corpsman Danny Walsh, secured the medical equipment in the cabin. Walsh had worked with Sarah on dozens of missions. He was young but skilled, and Sarah knew she could count on him to keep wounded soldiers alive during the flight back to base. The UH-60's twin engines spun up to full power. Sarah lifted off from the base and turned northeast toward the mountains. The night was clear but cold, with stars visible overhead. In a few hours, those stars would disappear behind the approaching weather system. As they flew toward the search area, Sarah tried to raise Alpha 7 on the radio. Static filled her headphones. Occasionally, she thought she heard voices, but the signal was too weak and broken to understand. The mountains were blocking radio transmission, which meant the SEAL team was either very low in a valley or their radio equipment was damaged. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah reached the last known position of Alpha 7. Below her, the mountainous terrain looked like a maze of dark valleys and sharp ridges. Each valley branched into smaller valleys, creating a complex network that could hide an entire army. Finding 12 men in this wilderness would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Sarah began a systematic search pattern, flying low through each valley and listening for radio signals. The Black Hawk's rotor noise echoed off the valley walls, creating a thunderous sound that could be heard for miles. If the SEALs were conscious and mobile, they would hear her aircraft and try to signal their location. After an hour of searching, Sarah's fuel gauge showed she was burning through her reserves faster than planned. The thin mountain air and constant maneuvering between valleys was consuming more fuel than a normal flight. She would need to make a decision soon, continue searching or return to base to refuel. That's when Rodriguez spotted something unusual. Ghost, check out that ridgeline at 2 o'clock. I'm seeing what looks like a strobe light. Sarah turned the aircraft toward the ridge Rodriguez had indicated. In the distance, a small light was flashing in a pattern. 3 long flashes, followed by 3 short flashes, then 3 long flashes again. It was Morse code for SOS, the International Distress Signal. I see it, Sarah said. That's got to be our guys. The strobe light was coming from a narrow ledge about halfway up a steep mountainside. Sarah could see that the ledge was barely wide enough for a few people to stand on. Below the ledge, the mountain dropped away into darkness. Above it, sheer rock face climbed toward the peak. Sarah circled the position to get a better view. Through her night vision goggles, she could make out several figures on the ledge. They were waving their arms and pointing upward, clearly trying to signal the helicopter. But there was a problem. There was no place to land. The ledge was too narrow for a helicopter landing. The valley floor was too far below to be reached by the aircraft's rescue hoist. The surrounding terrain was too steep and rocky for Sarah to set down anywhere close to the SEAL team's position. Rodriguez studied the situation through his own night vision equipment. Ghost, I don't see how we can get to them. That ledge won't hold the aircraft, and we're too far away for the hoist. Sarah analyzed every possible option. The rescue hoist had a maximum length of 200 feet. The SEAL team appeared to be at least 400 feet above the valley floor. Even if Sarah could hover at the exact right altitude, the hoist cable wouldn't reach the ledge where the SEALs were trapped. The radio crackled with a weak signal. Angel 7, this is Alpha 7. Can you hear us? Sarah keyed her microphone. Alpha 7, this is Angel 7. I can see your position. What's your status? Angel 7. We have multiple wounded. Cannot move from current position. Enemy forces in the valley below. The transmission cut out, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. The SEALs were wounded, trapped on a ledge, and there were enemy fighters somewhere in the area. A conventional rescue was impossible, but Sarah couldn't abandon 12 American soldiers. She circled the position again, studying every detail of the terrain. The mountainside was steep, but not completely vertical. There were small outcroppings and narrow ridges that might support the weight of a helicopter for a few seconds. It would be incredibly dangerous, but Sarah began to form a plan. "Rodriguez, what do you think about putting the aircraft down on that ridge about 100 feet above the ledge?" Rodriguez looked where Sarah was pointing. "Ghost, that ridge is maybe 6 feet wide. The rotor span on this bird is 53 feet. There's no way the rotors would clear the rock walls." Sarah studied the topography more carefully. The ridge Rodriguez was talking about was indeed too narrow. But there was another possibility, a small plateau about 200 feet above the SEAL team's position. It was larger than the ridge, but still smaller than a normal landing zone. The plateau was roughly circular and appeared to be about 60 feet across. The Black Hawk would fit, but there would be no room for error. If Sarah misjudged the landing by even a few feet, the aircraft could slide off the edge or catch a rotor blade on the surrounding rocks. "What about that flat area up there?" Sarah asked, pointing toward the plateau. Rodriguez studied the position through his night vision goggles. "It might work, but how do we get the wounded SEALs up there? That's a pretty steep climb." Sarah was already working out the logistics in her head. "We'll have to use climbing ropes. Walsh, do we have any mountaineering gear on board?" Corpsman Walsh checked the emergency equipment storage. "We've got some rescue rope and basic climbing hardware. Not much, but maybe enough for a short rappel operation." The plan was taking shape in Sarah's mind. She would land on the plateau and Walsh would rappel down to the ledge where the SEALs were trapped. He could treat the wounded and help them climb up to the helicopter. It was risky, but it was the only option that might work. Sarah keyed her radio to contact the base. "Operations, this is Angel 7. I've located Alpha 7, but the rescue is going to be complicated. I need you to patch me through to someone who knows the tactical situation in this area." "Angel 7, stand by." A few minutes later, a different voice came over the radio. "Angel 7, this is Colonel Harrison. What's your status?" Sarah explained the situation to her commanding officer. The SEALs were trapped on a ledge with no conventional landing zone available. Enemy forces were in the area, which meant the rescue would have to be fast. The approaching weather system would make the operation impossible in a few hours. Colonel Harrison listened to Sarah's plan without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause before he responded. "Angel 7, what you're describing is extremely dangerous. If something goes wrong, we could lose both the SEAL team and your crew." "Sir, if we don't try, Alpha 7 isn't going home at all. The weather's closing in, and they have wounded personnel who need immediate medical attention." Another pause. Sarah could almost hear her commanding officer weighing the risks and benefits. Finally, he came back on the radio. "Angel 7, you have authorization to attempt the rescue, but use your judgment. If the situation becomes too dangerous, abort and return to base." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. She had permission to try the most difficult rescue of her career. The lives of 12 Navy SEALs depended on her ability to land a Black Hawk helicopter on a tiny mountain plateau in the dark. She circled the area one more time, studying every detail of the approach. The wind was coming from the west, which meant she would have to approach the plateau against the mountainside. There were rock outcroppings that could catch the rotor blades if she wasn't careful. The altitude was high enough that the thin air would affect the helicopter's performance. Most importantly, Sarah realized she would only get one chance. If the landing attempt failed, she might not have enough fuel to try again. The wounded SEALs couldn't wait for another rescue aircraft to arrive. Rodriguez was checking the aircraft systems one final time. "Ghost, everything looks good on our end. Fuel is getting low, but we should have enough for the rescue and the flight back to base. Walsh was preparing his medical equipment and the climbing gear. I'm ready to go down there as soon as you get us on the ground. Sarah took a deep breath and began her approach to the plateau. The Black Hawk descended slowly through the darkness, guided only by her night vision goggles and years of flying experience. Below her, 12 American soldiers were counting on her to get this right. The rescue operation was about to begin. The Black Hawk shuddered as Sarah began her descent toward the narrow plateau. The mountain winds created unpredictable air currents that pushed the helicopter in different directions. Through her night vision goggles, the landing area looked even smaller than it had from a distance. She had to get this right on the first try. Rodriguez watched the radar altimeter as they descended. 50 feet above the plateau. 40. 30. The rotor wash from the Black Hawk's main rotor was bouncing off the mountainside and creating turbulence. Sarah fought to keep the aircraft steady as rocks and debris flew through the air around them. She could feel the helicopter wanting to drift toward the edge of the plateau. 20 feet. 10 feet. Sarah's hands moved constantly on the flight controls, making tiny adjustments to counter the wind gusts and turbulence. The aircraft's landing gear made contact with solid rock. For a moment, the Black Hawk sat stable on the small plateau. Then the left wheel slipped on loose gravel. The helicopter tilted toward the edge of the cliff. Sarah immediately applied power and pulled back on the collective, lifting the aircraft a few feet off the ground. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained calm over the intercom. Trying again. Rodriguez, call out any drift you see. Sarah repositioned the helicopter and began another approach. This time she came in at a different angle, trying to find the most stable part of the plateau. The aircraft touched down again, and this time all 3 wheels found solid footing. We're down, Rodriguez called out. Stable contact, but we're close to the edge on the north side. Sarah kept the engines running and the rotors turning. They couldn't shut down completely because restarting at this altitude might not work if the engines cooled too much. She also wanted to be ready for a quick departure if enemy forces appeared in the valley below. Walsh was already preparing for his descent to the ledge where the SEALs were trapped. He had rappelling equipment and medical supplies packed in a large backpack. The plan was for him to treat the wounded on the ledge, then help them climb up to the helicopter one at a time. Ghost. I can see the SEALs clearly from here, Walsh reported. Looks like 3 or 4 of them aren't moving much. The others are setting up some kind of security perimeter on that tiny ledge. Sarah studied the route Walsh would need to take. The climb from the helicopter to the ledge was steep, but manageable with proper equipment. The bigger challenge would be getting wounded soldiers back up the same route. Walsh attached his rappelling gear to anchor points inside the helicopter. He had worked out a system where he could lower medical supplies first, then descend to treat the wounded SEALs. After stabilizing the casualties, he would help them climb back up using a mechanical advantage system with ropes and pulleys. Be careful down there, Sarah told her medic. If you run into trouble, we'll figure out another way. Walsh nodded and began his descent. Sarah watched through her night vision as he rappelled down the steep mountainside toward the trapped SEAL team. The distance was greater than it looked from above, nearly 200 feet of vertical rock face. While Walsh made his way down, Rodriguez monitored the radio frequencies for any sign of enemy activity. Intelligence reports had mentioned Taliban fighters in the area, and the sound of the Black Hawk's rotors could be heard for miles in the mountain valleys. Sarah kept her hands on the flight controls, ready to take off at a moment's notice. The helicopter was sitting on a piece of ground barely larger than a basketball court, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides. If they needed to leave quickly, there was only one direction they could go. After what felt like hours but was actually only 15 minutes, Walsh reached the ledge where the SEALs were positioned. Sarah could hear him talking to the team leader through the radio. Angel 7, this is Walsh. I'm with Alpha 7 now. We have 4 serious casualties and 2 walking wounded. The rest of the team is functional but low on ammunition. Sarah keyed her microphone. What's the nature of the injuries? 2 gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, 1 compound leg fracture, and 1 severe head trauma from an explosion. The head trauma case is unconscious but breathing. I need to stabilize these guys before we can move them. Walsh immediately went to work on the wounded SEALs. He had brought IV fluids, trauma bandages, and emergency medications. Working by flashlight on a ledge barely 6 feet wide, he began treating the most seriously injured soldiers. The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, briefed Sarah on what had happened to his unit. They had been conducting a reconnaissance mission near the Pakistani border when they were ambushed by a large group of Taliban fighters. During the firefight, they had been forced to retreat up the mountainside. We climbed as high as we could go, Morrison explained over the radio. This ledge was the only place we could make a defensive stand. We've been here for 6 hours, and the enemy is still down in the valley somewhere. Sarah asked about enemy strength and capabilities. Morrison estimated there were at least 30 Taliban fighters with small arms and possibly rocket-propelled grenades. They had been probing the base of the mountain, looking for a way to reach the trapped SEALs. Angel 7, if those fighters find a route up here, we won't be able to hold them off, Morrison said. We're down to less than 2 magazines per man. The tactical situation was getting worse. Sarah realized they were not just conducting a medical evacuation, they were extracting a besieged unit that could be overrun at any moment. The rescue needed to happen fast. Walsh had stabilized the head trauma patient and was working on one of the gunshot victims. His voice came over the radio with an update. Ghost, I'm going to need help getting these wounded guys up to your position. Some of them can't climb under their own power. Sarah made a decision that went against standard operating procedures but might save lives. She shut down the Black Hawk's engines to conserve fuel and reduce noise. Then she grabbed a climbing harness from the emergency equipment and prepared to join Walsh on the ledge. Rodriguez, you stay with the aircraft, monitor the radios, and be ready to start engines on my signal. Rodriguez looked concerned. Ghost, if you get stuck down there with Walsh, who's going to fly us out of here? Sarah was already attaching her rappelling gear. I'm the strongest climber on this crew. Walsh can't get 4 wounded men up that cliff by himself, especially with enemy forces in the area. She began her descent toward the ledge, moving faster than Walsh had but still being careful on the steep rock face. As she got closer to the SEAL team's position, she could see the true scope of their situation. The ledge was smaller than a hotel room, with 12 men crowded together and barely enough space to move around. The wounded SEALs were in serious condition. One had been shot in the chest and was having trouble breathing. Another had taken a bullet in the abdomen and was losing blood despite Walsh's treatment. The soldier with the compound leg fracture was conscious but in severe pain. The head trauma case was still unconscious. Morrison briefed Sarah on his team's defensive preparations. They had positioned their remaining weapons to cover the most likely approaches enemy fighters could use to reach the ledge. But with limited ammunition and several men out of action, they couldn't hold their position much longer. How long before that weather system hits us? Morrison asked. Sarah looked at the western sky. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, and she could already feel the wind picking up. Maybe 2 hours before visibility goes to 0. We need to be off this mountain before then. Walsh had finished his initial treatment of the wounded and was preparing them for evacuation. The 2 most seriously injured SEALs would need to be carried up to the helicopter on improvised stretchers. The walking wounded could climb with assistance. Sarah studied the route back up to the plateau. It was steep and treacherous, but with proper rope work and teamwork, they could get everyone to the helicopter. The bigger question was whether they had enough time before enemy forces found them. That question was answered when Morrison's radio operator reported movement in the valley below. Lieutenant Commander, I'm seeing lights about 2 clicks south of our position. Looks like vehicle headlights moving this way. Morrison used night vision binoculars to confirm the sighting. Angel 7, we have enemy vehicles approaching our location. Estimate 15 to 20 minutes before they reach the base of this mountain. Sarah felt the pressure building. They had less than 20 minutes to evacuate 12 men, including 4 serious casualties, up a nearly vertical cliff face. Once the Taliban fighters reached the mountain, they would start climbing toward the ledge. "Walsh, we need to start moving people now," Sarah said. "Can the walking wounded make the climb?" Walsh checked on the 2 less seriously injured SEALs. Both had been hit by shrapnel but were mobile. With help, they could probably make it up the rope system to the plateau. Sarah organized the evacuation in priority order. The walking wounded would go first, followed by the uninjured SEALs, then the serious casualties. Morrison and 2 of his men would stay on the ledge until everyone else was evacuated, providing security in case enemy fighters reached their position. The first wounded SEAL, a sergeant with shrapnel wounds in his leg, began the climb toward the helicopter. Sarah had rigged a mechanical advantage system using pulleys and carabiners that would help pull injured men up the cliff. 2 SEALs at the helicopter would pull on the rope while Sarah and Walsh guided the climber from below. The system worked, but it was slow. Each injured man took nearly 10 minutes to make the climb. With multiple casualties and limited time before enemy arrival, Sarah realized they might not get everyone out before the fighting started. Morrison was tracking the enemy vehicles through his night vision equipment. "Angel 7, those trucks stopped about 1 click out. I'm seeing dismounted personnel moving toward our position on foot." Sarah made another tactical decision. "Morrison, send 4 of your healthy men up now. Leave just enough on the ledge to provide security for the wounded." 4 SEALs immediately started climbing toward the plateau. They moved much faster than the wounded men, reaching the helicopter in less than 5 minutes each. Rodriguez helped them into the Black Hawk and prepared the aircraft for a quick departure. As the evacuation continued, Walsh worked on preparing the seriously wounded for transport. The soldier with the head injury was still unconscious but stable. The chest wound victim was having more trouble breathing and needed constant monitoring. The abdominal wound was controlled but still bleeding slowly. With half the team evacuated, Sarah looked at her watch. They had been on the mountain for over an hour, and the enemy vehicles were getting closer. Morrison reported that Taliban fighters were now at the base of the mountain and beginning to climb. "Angel 7, we've got movement on the eastern approach to our position. I estimate 15 to 20 fighters, and they're armed with automatic weapons." Sarah realized they were running out of time. The remaining SEALs included Morrison, 1 security man, and the 4 wounded soldiers. Getting them all to the helicopter before the enemy reached the ledge would be nearly impossible. That's when she heard the sound of gunfire echoing through the valley. Morrison's voice came over the radio with urgency. "Contact. We have enemy fighters approximately 300 meters below our position and climbing. They've spotted our muzzle flashes." The situation had just changed from a rescue mission to a combat evacuation. Sarah could hear automatic weapons fire coming from multiple directions in the valley below. The Taliban fighters weren't just climbing toward the ledge. They were also engaging other American forces in the area. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the helicopter's radio system. "Ghost, I'm monitoring military frequencies. We have a quick reaction force moving toward our area, but they're 30 minutes out." 30 minutes was too long. The enemy fighters would reach the ledge in less than 10 minutes. And Sarah still had 5 men to evacuate. She looked at Walsh, who was preparing to help carry the most seriously wounded SEAL up the cliff. "Walsh, can that head trauma patient survive the climb?" The medic checked the unconscious soldier's vital signs. "His breathing and pulse are stable, but I'm worried about moving him too much. If he has a brain injury, the stress of evacuation could make it worse." Sarah faced an impossible choice. They could try to evacuate everyone and risk losing the entire group to enemy fire, or they could prioritize the soldiers most likely to survive and leave the others behind. Neither option was acceptable. Morrison made the decision for her. Angel 7, get the wounded out of here. My men and I will hold this position until the quick reaction force arrives. Sarah knew what Morrison was really saying. He and his remaining healthy SEALs would stay behind to fight off the Taliban attackers while she evacuated the wounded. It was a noble gesture, but it meant certain death for the men who stayed. Morrison, I'm not leaving anyone on this mountain. Angel 7, that's an order. We're trained for this situation. Get those wounded men to medical care. Sarah looked up at the helicopter, then at the wounded SEALs on the ledge. She was running out of options, but she refused to abandon American soldiers. There had to be another way. That's when she remembered something her father had taught her about flying in Montana. Sometimes the impossible solution was the only one that worked. She keyed her radio to contact Rodriguez at the helicopter. Rodriguez, start engines. We're going to try something different. The Black Hawk's engines roared to life as Rodriguez followed Sarah's orders. On the ledge below, Morrison and his men could hear enemy fighters getting closer. The sound of boots on rock and shouted commands in Pashto echoed up from the darkness below. Sarah's plan was dangerous beyond anything she had ever attempted. Instead of evacuating the remaining SEALs one by one, she was going to bring the helicopter down to the ledge itself. The narrow shelf of rock was barely wide enough for the aircraft's landing gear, but it was the only way to get everyone out before the Taliban fighters reached their position. Rodriguez, I need you to hover the aircraft about 20 feet above the ledge, Sarah radioed from her position with the wounded SEALs. Don't try to land. Just hold steady while we load everyone. Rodriguez's voice came back tense with concern. Ghost, the rotor clearance is going to be maybe 2 feet on each side. One gust of wind and we're going to hit the rock wall. I know the risks. Just hold her steady. Walsh was already preparing the wounded for emergency evacuation. The unconscious head trauma patient would have to be carried to the helicopter by 2 men. The chest wound victim could walk, but would need support. The abdominal wound was stable enough for movement. Morrison organized his remaining healthy SEALs for the evacuation. When that bird comes down, we move fast and we move together. No one gets left behind. The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Taliban fighters had found a route up the eastern side of the mountain and were less than 5 minutes from reaching the ledge. Morrison's radio operator was monitoring enemy communications and reported that more fighters were climbing from the western approach. Sarah looked up as the Black Hawk descended through the darkness toward the ledge. The aircraft's rotor wash created a hurricane of wind and debris on the narrow shelf of rock. Rodriguez was fighting to keep the helicopter stable as mountain winds and rotor turbulence combined to create unpredictable air currents. The main rotor blades were so close to the rock walls that Sarah could hear them cutting through the air with a different sound than normal flight. Rodriguez was using every skill he had learned in 20 years of flying to keep the aircraft positioned correctly. 15 feet above the ledge, Rodriguez called over the radio. This is as low as I can safely go. That meant the helicopter's cabin door was still 8 feet above the rocky ledge where the wounded SEALs waited. Sarah realized they would need to find another way to bridge that gap. Walsh had an idea. We can use the rescue hoist. It's not rated for this kind of operation, but it should hold long enough to get everyone up. The rescue hoist was normally used to lift individual soldiers from the ground during medical evacuations. Using it to lift multiple wounded men at the same time was dangerous and against regulations, but it was their only option. Morrison helped rig the first wounded SEAL to the rescue hoist. The soldier with the compound leg fracture couldn't put weight on his injured limb, so they fashioned a makeshift seat using climbing webbing and carabiners. Lifting now, called the crew chief, who was operating the hoist from inside the helicopter. The wounded SEAL rose slowly from the ledge toward the Black Hawk's cabin. Wind from the main rotor made him spin and sway on the cable, but the hoist mechanism held his weight. After what felt like an eternity, hands reached out from the helicopter to pull him inside. The process was repeated with the chest wound victim, then the abdominal wound patient. Each lift took precious minutes, and the sound of enemy fighters was getting closer with each passing moment. That's when Morrison spotted muzzle flashes in the darkness below. "Contact front! Enemy fighters! 200 meters and closing." The Taliban attackers had reached a position where they could see the ledge and the hovering helicopter. Automatic weapons fire began hitting the rock face around the SEAL position. Bullets ricocheted off stone, sending fragments flying in all directions. Morrison and his 2 remaining healthy SEALs returned fire, but they were heavily outnumbered. The enemy fighters had taken positions in rocks and crevices below the ledge, making them difficult targets in the darkness. Rodriguez was struggling to keep the helicopter steady as bullets began hitting the aircraft. "Ghost, we're taking fire! I've got warning lights on multiple systems!" Sarah looked at the unconscious SEAL who still needed to be evacuated. He was the most seriously wounded and would require 2 men to lift him safely onto the rescue hoist, but Morrison and his men were fully engaged in the firefight and couldn't spare anyone to help with the evacuation. The enemy fire was increasing in intensity. Sarah could hear bullets striking the Black Hawk's fuselage and see sparks where tracer rounds hit the metal skin. One lucky shot could hit a critical system and bring down the aircraft. "Morrison, we need to get that last wounded man up now," Sarah shouted over the noise of gunfire and rotor blades. "Working on it. Give me 30 seconds." Sarah knew they didn't have 30 seconds. The Taliban fighters were advancing up the mountain and would soon be in position to overrun the ledge. Rodriguez was reporting multiple aircraft systems showing damage from enemy fire. That's when Sarah made a decision that would define her entire military career. Instead of waiting for Morrison to help with the wounded SEAL, she clipped herself into the rescue hoist alongside the unconscious soldier. The hoist was only rated for single-person lifts, but Sarah weighed less than most men, and the injured SEAL was not particularly large. "Lift us both," she called to the crew chief. "Ghost, that's way over the weight limit for the hoist." "Do it now!" The rescue hoist strained under the combined weight of Sarah and the wounded SEAL. The motor struggled to lift both of them, rising much more slowly than the previous evacuations. Enemy bullets continued to snap through the air around them as they ascended toward the helicopter. Halfway up, the hoist mechanism began to make grinding noises. Sarah could feel the cable jerking as the motor fought to maintain the lift. If the system failed now, both she and the wounded SEAL would fall back to the ledge. "Come on," Sarah whispered, holding tight to the unconscious soldier as they rose through the darkness. The hoist held long enough to get them both to the helicopter cabin. Hands reached out to pull them inside just as the motor finally gave out with a shower of sparks and smoke. But there were still 3 men on the ledge, Morrison and his 2 SEALs, and no way to get them up to the helicopter. The rescue hoist was destroyed, and enemy fire was too intense for Rodriguez to bring the aircraft any lower. Morrison's voice came over the radio with calm professionalism despite the desperate situation. "Angel 7, get out of here while you can. We'll hold this position until the quick reaction force arrives." Sarah looked down at the ledge where Morrison and his men were fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. She could see muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions as Taliban fighters closed in from 3 directions. In a few minutes, the ledge would be overrun. "Rodriguez, take us down to the ledge level. I'm going to try something." "Ghost, the rotor clearance won't allow it. We'll hit the rock walls." Sarah studied the ledge and the surrounding terrain one more time. The shelf of rock was narrow, but it was straight and relatively flat. More importantly, it was long enough that a helicopter might be able to land if the pilot was skilled enough and brave enough. "Rodriguez, switch positions with me." "I'm taking the controls." Rodriguez looked at Sarah with amazement. "Ghost, you want to land this bird on a ledge that's barely wider than our landing gear?" "It's the only way to get Morrison and his men out alive." Rodriguez moved to the co-pilot seat as Sarah took control of the Black Hawk. She had landed helicopters in impossible places before, but nothing like this. The ledge was perhaps 8 feet wide and 50 feet long. The UH-60's landing gear had a span of nearly 9 feet. Enemy fire continued to hit the aircraft as Sarah began her descent toward the ledge. She could see Morrison and his men were down to their last magazines of ammunition. Taliban fighters were advancing from multiple directions, and the SEAL team would be overrun within minutes. The helicopter's main rotor was now less than 10 feet above the ledge. The rotor wash was creating a storm of wind and debris that made it difficult for anyone to see or move on the narrow shelf of rock. Sarah could feel the aircraft wanting to drift toward the cliff face as mountain winds and rotor turbulence fought against her control inputs. Ghost. The left rotor tip is maybe 18 inches from the rock wall, Rodriguez called out, watching their clearance through his night vision goggles. Sarah made micro-adjustments to the flight controls, using every bit of skill and experience she had gained in 20 years of flying. The Black Hawk's main rotor was a spinning disk of death that could disintegrate instantly if it touched solid rock. The aircraft's left wheel touched the edge of the ledge. Sarah felt the helicopter tilt slightly as the landing gear found purchase on the narrow shelf of stone. The right wheel came down next, and suddenly the full weight of the Black Hawk was resting on a piece of mountain barely wide enough to support it. "We're down," Rodriguez called out. "All 3 wheels in contact." Morrison and his 2 SEALs immediately began moving toward the helicopter. They laid down covering fire to suppress the advancing Taliban fighters while running across the narrow ledge. The cabin door was open and waiting for them. The first SEAL dove through the door and rolled into the cargo compartment. The second man followed, dragging extra ammunition and equipment. Morrison came last, firing his rifle until the magazine was empty, then sprinting the final few steps to the helicopter. As soon as Morrison was inside, Sarah applied power and lifted off from the ledge. The Black Hawk rose into the night sky just as Taliban fighters reached the position where the SEALs had been fighting. Automatic weapons fire followed the aircraft as it climbed away from the mountain, but the enemy bullets fell short. Sarah turned the helicopter toward the base, flying low through the mountain valleys to avoid any additional enemy forces. Behind them, the ledge where 12 American soldiers had been trapped was now occupied by Taliban fighters who had arrived just minutes too late. The flight back to base took 30 minutes. Walsh worked frantically to stabilize the wounded SEALs during the journey. The head trauma patient had regained consciousness and was able to respond to simple commands. The chest-wound victim was breathing easier with supplemental oxygen. All 4 seriously wounded soldiers were alive and stable. As they approached the base, Sarah could see medical personnel and ambulances waiting at the flight line. Intelligence officers and command staff were also present, having monitored the rescue operation from the Tactical Operations Center. Sarah set the Black Hawk down gently on the landing pad. Medical teams immediately rushed to the aircraft to evacuate the wounded SEALs. Within minutes, all 4 casualties were on their way to the base hospital for emergency surgery. Morrison approached Sarah as she shut down the engines. His uniform was torn and dirty, and he had minor shrapnel wounds on his face and hands. But he was alive. All 12 members of his SEAL team had survived the mission. "Captain Mitchell," Morrison said, extending his hand, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did tonight was impossible." Sarah shook the SEAL officer's hand. "It's what we're here for, Commander. I'm just glad everyone made it home." Colonel Harrison arrived at the flight line as Sarah completed her post-flight inspection of the helicopter. The aircraft had taken multiple bullet hits and suffered damage to several systems, but it had held together long enough to complete the mission. "Captain, I've been flying for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight," Colonel Harrison said. "Landing a Black Hawk on a ledge that narrow under fire in mountain terrain, that's not supposed to be possible." Sarah looked back at the helicopter that had carried 12 wounded American soldiers to safety. The aircraft bore scars from enemy bullets and showed signs of stress from the extreme flying conditions, but it had performed flawlessly when it mattered most. "Sir, sometimes impossible is the only option that works." News of the rescue spread quickly through the special operations community. Within days, Sarah received commendation requests from Navy, Army, and Marine commands. The official after-action report described the mission as one of the most daring helicopter rescues in military history. But Sarah didn't think much about medals or recognition. She was already planning for the next mission, the next time American soldiers would need someone to bring them home from an impossible situation. The wounded SEALs all recovered from their injuries. The head trauma patient spent 2 weeks in intensive care, but made a full recovery. The chest and abdominal wound victims required multiple surgeries, but returned to active duty within 6 months. Morrison and his team were back in the field within a month, conducting new missions in support of the war effort. 6 months later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden plaque with an inscription that read, "To Angel 7, the ghost who never leaves anyone behind, from Alpha 7. Sarah hung the plaque in her quarters, next to a photo of the UH-60 Black Hawk that had carried 12 American soldiers home from a mountain ledge in Afghanistan. She continued flying combat missions for another 3 years, accumulating more successful rescues and earning a reputation as one of the finest helicopter pilots in military service. When she finally left the Army, Sarah had completed over 200 combat missions and saved the lives of more than 400 American soldiers. But when people asked about her most memorable mission, she always talked about the night she landed a helicopter on a ledge barely wider than the aircraft itself to save 12 Navy SEALs who refused to leave their wounded behind. The military gave Sarah many medals for her service: Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, but the recognition she valued most was the simple trust of soldiers who knew that when they called for Angel 7, someone would always come to bring them home. Sarah returned to Montana after her military service, where she started a helicopter rescue service for civilian emergencies. She flew search and rescue missions in the Rocky Mountains, medical evacuations from remote areas, and firefighting support during wildfire season. She never talked much about her military service, preferring to let her flying skills speak for themselves. On quiet evenings at the ranch where she grew up, Sarah would sometimes stand in her father's old hangar and look at the restored crop dusters he had worked on so many years earlier. The sound of helicopter engines in the distance would remind her of cold nights in Afghanistan and American soldiers who needed someone to bring them home from impossible places. The ghost who never left anyone behind had finally found peace, but she never stopped being ready to answer the call when someone needed help. In the mountains of Montana or the valleys of Afghanistan, Sarah Mitchell knew that sometimes the impossible solution was the only one that worked.